Namaste, everyone, and thank you for inviting me here. Thank you, Mara. Thank you. It's a pleasure to come and always talk to young people. But unlike all the other eminent persons, I don't think I should have asked my young escort to show me that list of the speakers whom you all are going to meet, because clearly they have far more expertise in their domain than I do. So really, I'm hoping to make this more of a kind of interactive session, whereas citizens and students together, we can look at issues of water security and water across the country. So that's how my little caveat before we begin. I know I have time till about 1:30. I also know that you had a 2-hour lecture, very intense one on energy before. So my style is really to talk about a few large, broad points first. And then I'd really like to open it up for all of us to engage in questions around what do we mean by sustainable development? The kind of trade-offs that are always going to be involved when we talk of sustainability and equity. How do we do them? Under what kind of institutions of society do we come to some kind of consensus in a country as diverse as this? Whether it's issues of food, whether it's issues of energy, whether it's issues of water, eventually a common theme that does come is what do people want? And what are the governance mechanisms that are there today to help people achieve what they want and need? And what are the trade-offs that we all have to make so that it's not just our individual rights that get exercised, but the benefit of all. And I think this is going to be a common thread you will see throughout all the lectures of the wonderful lectures planned for you this week. So, to talk of water, nobody can be divorced from the issues of water at all. Not a single living thing on this planet, as we know. And many of us might already know some of the big picture statistics, but let's just very quickly run through them so that we know within what situation in India we have to work about water. Broadly, we all know, and today you can see the palpable tension in the country. Is the monsoon going to fail? So the first thing we know is year on year on year, especially in the subcontinent, all of us are holding our collective breaths saying, in come June, for the 4 months, will the rain gods deliver? And actually that's the biggest security that we have to worry about, and it's a little bit beyond our control, especially with climate change issues coming up. The first thing of all, will the rain gods do their bit, is something that all of us have to tackle with every day. And it doesn't matter who you are, where you are in the country. It doesn't matter where you're living in the biggest city in the country or you're living in the smallest village, anywhere, even in the tribal areas. You still have to worry whether the rain gods will deliver, because as Sunita Narayan of CSE often says, the rain gods are the ministers of water in this country. So that's why my state government, in its enlightenment, has just allocated 17 crore rupees to ensure that all the temples and trusts under its jurisdiction will do homas and pujas and say, please rain. We can argue towards the end of the lecture whether that 17 crores could have been used to create more sustainable water management and harvesting practices, but so be it. In a country as diverse as ours, we try everything. So the big picture then is the country of India gets about 4,000 billion cubic meters of rainfall, which then of course goes into our rivers, which goes into the ground, which then eventually goes out into the sea. And only about less than a quarter of it is actually usable to us every year as fresh water. We have about 4% of the world's freshwater resources, and we have, as you might guess, about 17% of the world's population. Now, either it means all of us have to have a very low water footprint, or we have to have extremely high efficiencies in the way we use that 4% of water. And for many, many, many decades, of course, we took water for granted. We built lots of super water infrastructure in the country. You all must have read about the various dams, the hydro projects, the reservoirs, etc., that we built over the decades since independence. But in spite of all that, we don't use any one kind of resource in this country. There is such a diversity of the monsoon going from the Assam, all know about Cherrapunji, down into Jaisalmer and Balmer here in the west. Our water, the rainfall is extremely diverse, scattered, and completely depends on your topography. You can either get as little as 100 millimeters of rain in just one shower. And I've been to those places because Argyam is working in some of those areas in Balmer. All the water that you're going to get this year is going to likely come to you in 1 or 2 showers. And that's it. And you're not connected, you're not close to the sea, you don't have any rivers, and somehow as a society, you have to manage with that, and we'll talk about that a little bit. Or if you're very lucky, you will get anything as much as 1700 millimeters of rain up there in the northeast, and somewhere like Bangalore, you'll get 800 to 900 millimeters of rain, and Delhi is somewhere close to that as well. So you have extreme diversity of rainfall, and people over centuries have learned how to cope with that kind of diversity. But nowadays the thinking is, as we move towards universal access, the goal of this country's Water Resources Ministry and every state is to ensure that every single person in India gets, at his or her convenience, at all times, adequate, safe, and reliable water at all times. So increasingly the norms have been devised so that around the country you are expected, the government and the local bodies are expected to deliver to people 55 liters per capita per day. That's the norm stipulated for rural areas. And 130, actually depends, somewhere between 110 and 135 LPCD per day in urban areas. And we can talk later why there is a disparity in those two norms as well. So we see that if we start looking at that kind of LPCD requirement, and we start looking at what actual water resources are available to us, and we look at the growth of the population, you will begin to see that if we are not careful, within a short period of time, we will hit what a lady called Falkenmark called the water stress level, that will drop to below. She said, after doing much calculation, that you need at least 1,000 cubic meters per person per year in order to have a healthy, safe access of water in a society. And India is heading, in the next 10 years, we could easily go below that mark. So governments are worried, people are worried. Every time you have a deficit monsoon, it has, of course, cascading impacts on food and energy security as well. But just the first lifeline, water, our water resources are vulnerable if the monsoon doesn't come. So that's where we are heading. People are saying that we are heading for a water crisis. The Planning Commission often has said that more than energy and food, we should be worried about a looming water crisis in this country. So I'd like to talk a little more about that. So that's the big picture. What are we going to do, and where are we headed? Who uses this water? About 85 to 89% of all our water, where does it go? It goes into irrigation. The farm sector is the biggest user of water in this country, and about 5 to 7% goes for domestic consumption, like we use every day. We all got up and hopefully had our showers and brushed our teeth, and we need water 2 liters for drinking. And 5 to 7% of all our water goes into domestic consumption, which leaves the rest for? Yes, for industry, for the services sector, the manufacturing sector, the energy sector. So that's how our water is roughly divided. This is actually quite unusual because in other countries we have seen those numbers change dramatically, and I'm sure in the energy talk and even in the food talk some of this will come up. In other countries, water usage has moved with people. In the sense, as people have moved out from their agricultural, as fewer and fewer people have been engaged in the agricultural sector and moved into industry or into urban services, the water footprint has moved along with that. But in India, we have not still seen that, which is why our policy people, our activists, our farmers are very much concerned to say, how shall we improve the efficiency of the water used in agriculture? Because eventually there's a common pool, and if you want your industries to pick up, if you want your economy to diversify out of the farm sector, then every single thing we do, as you know, needs water. This desk has water hidden in it, as you know. Everything that looks very solid has water in it, and we know the concept of virtual water has gained ground. So any economic activity has water embedded in it, and we can't produce more water, so where will this water come from? It will have to come from that 85 to 89%, which is currently being used by agriculture. And hence, unless we are able, and this talk and this movement and these attempts have been going on for the last 2 decades at least, unless we can produce more crop per drop, there are going to be all kinds of conflict over the competition on that same water resource, and we are beginning to see that emerging already. This is an area of concern. So if we see 85 to 89% of water used in agriculture, 5 to 7% used for domestic, and the rest going into industry, then one also has to wonder, have we left out somebody? Have we left out something when we say this water is being used like that? Have we left out any kind of use of water which we are not talking about when we just talk of these 3 sectors?
Icebergs.
The icebergs, etc. Well, actually, yeah, we are not actually talking about environment flows here at all. We try to say that we can allocate out all this water, but today's modern thinking, and I'm sure all of you know more about it as you study sustainable development and environmental issues, we have to start thinking about environment flows, because I've been saying for a while that we now know that the economy, it rests on the ecology, is it not? If you don't have a healthy ecology, and if you don't have your environment flows, and then you're not producing the ecosystem services that make every other resource useful to us, then you're going to be not having a very sustainable management of any of your resources, including water. So even though we say that we have all this water and we can use all of this, you will hear some people often complain that much of India's water just flows off into the oceans as waste. But actually nobody knows exactly how much the environment needs. There are some guesstimates, but nobody is able to pinpoint and say, yes, this much is the minimum environment flow. People are now talking about maximizing environment flows, and therefore saying what you extract should be justifiable. Don't look at it as some water tank which you can empty out each year. Look at it, in fact, as a flow, saying how much minimal water can I take out for any of my activities, agriculture, industry, domestic, ourselves, and say, let all of it go back again to nature so that it can produce again the ecosystem services that we all need and we depend upon, whether it's your forests, which produce the water in the first place, your healthy river ecosystems and everything else, your wetlands, you need all of that. One of the problems in India has been that we have been focused more on using land, and especially in urban areas like Delhi, we look at land as though that is the most prime economic mover. But because of that, we have not looked at land as a reservoir for water, and that's why the 800 lakes that used to be here in Delhi, how many of you saw Satyameva Jayate and the water episode? Okay, good. So I don't have to compete too much with Amir Khan. Okay, so 800 lakes in Delhi disappeared. We had thousands of lakes around Bangalore. They disappeared. Why? Because land became more economically valuable, and we had forgotten what is the real ecological cost of depleting your... We forgot how to count up the value of water on land. So these are some of the beginning of the issues when we look at the big picture and the big numbers in water. I come from a bit of a bias of domestic water, because Argyam, when we started out in 2005, we thought water is so big. You can talk about the tap in your home, and you can talk about the well in your backyard, and that is one scale of looking at water. And then you can look at the glaciers, and you can look at the big rivers, and you can look at the valleys and deltas, and that's a very different scale of water. So we came thinking about the people of this country and what do they need, and that is lifeline water. Water for day-to-day consumption, water for domestic use, and a little bit of livelihood water. Most of our people need water for their cattle, and they need a little bit of water for their domestic industry, cottage industries as well. So Argyam decided to focus all its work on domestic water. So my understanding is a little bit biased on that side. So when I'm now going to talk to you about water security, I'm really coming from the drinking water and sanitation perspective. You would have got some idea about water related to energy this morning. I believe Professor Abhijit Sen is going to talk to you in the afternoon, and I'm sure he'll bring in a lot of the food and water nexus in his speech. So here let's talk a little bit about water for the home, water for life. The Ministry of Drinking Water and Sanitation of the Union Ministry of Rural Development, it is a separate division of that, tells us a very nice picture over the years. We can safely say that it is true that the picture of access to water, to safe, reliable access to water is actually improving. You can see an improving curve over the last decades. For example, from the last census to this one, we are seeing a fair amount of improvement. Let me give you some numbers. We have about 75% of our habitations are fully covered. That means they have access to water. Households have access to water within 50 meters of where they are, or 50 meters height of where they are, and they are getting adequate quantities. There are still some 15% of habitations that are not fully covered, and that's still, given the 1.2 billion people, that's still far too many people who don't have adequate cover, but it's all moving on the way up, and that's a good sign. There are some slippages, unfortunately, and this also the ministry has been keeping statistics of, that you still have 10-15% what they call slippage, which an area which was already covered and there was some reliability of the water, either because the water got polluted or because the water source itself dried up, again slipped back into being uncovered. And actually, as we will find out, this is the real story behind the sustainability of our water resources and the operability of our water supply systems. So water resources, what are we doing? Are we making sure that they are sustainable? And the way we look after our supply systems, are we making sure that the operations and maintenance are being done properly at the right time, at the right cost, with the right outcome? I think these are the issues that will tell us whether or not we are achieving what most people are now saying, and rightly so, is the fundamental right of all people to have water whenever they need it, as much as they need for their life. Who governs water, and where does the actual water for life in India come from? How many people think that the water that we get is mostly from surface bodies like rivers and lakes and streams and springs? How many people think that that's where most people in India get their water from? Okay. How many people think that most people in India get their water from groundwater sources? Okay, and you are absolutely right. About 85% of all India's drinking water comes from groundwater. We seem to be, and this has been true over a long period of time. I think, as one of my colleagues says, we are really a groundwater civilization. What does that mean? It means that for centuries we've had the culture of wells, and we've understood our aquifers with folklore, with folk science. We've understood how to keep our aquifers alive, and we have been using groundwater reasonably sustainably for centuries. Right now, do you think, how many people think we are doing a great job using our groundwater sustainably in 2012? Come on, there must be some optimist out there. Not a single hand raised up. No, actually it's dreadful, and you've been seeing it all over the newspapers. For some reason, a civilization that has been so wise about water for so long has very quickly dumped its wisdom and said, you know, modern science will come and save us, or governments will come and save us. And if you have this much of land in India, right now, there's almost nothing to stop you, so long as you have the money, to dig a hole in the ground and pull out the aquifer. because of that, because we still don't have, and of course people are seized of it, policymakers, activists, people, citizens, we are beginning to be much more seized of it than even 5 years ago. Because we do not have, and this is a real public policy gap, and we must talk about it in our conversation, because we have not quite figured out how to regulate our groundwater yet, through what laws, through adequate checks and balances, so that anybody with a piece of land and a little bit of money and a rig cannot indiscriminately pull out water. We have reached a situation where in Punjab and Haryana, for instance, some parts of the country, we are losing a meter of water table every year. And in a situation like this, when the rains fail, either the farmers need to pump up more, or because when the rains fail, the electricity fails too. In some ways, it prevents them from draining out the aquifer. Now, I don't know if that's good or bad, because it prevents them from getting access to that water. So 85% of our water coming out, drinking water coming out of groundwater sources, 23 million or so, or maybe more are dug every day, bore wells in the country, tens of lakhs of dug wells, shallow wells, giving us water from the ground, and not enough sustainable management practices of that groundwater. In some areas of the country, we are pulling out 3 times what nature can help recharge. How long will that last? Yes, water is an infinitely renewable resource, but in temporally it can be very finite. It takes years and years for that water to recharge your wells and your tube wells. And if you don't recharge your aquifers, if you don't draw out sustainability, if you do a run on the bank, well, then you're not going to have that water. And in India, if we don't protect our drinking water resources first, in an area where your water tables are dropping so badly, then where are you going to get your drinking water from? These are going to be issues that are going to face all of us. Some of us living in apartments here, buildings here know where the groundwater tankers are coming. Who knows where they are getting their water from? We know a whole parallel regime has come up to supply groundwater, and completely outside the purview of government. So big public policy gap we are seeing is groundwater management. The center has been talking about, there is a draft bill and some states do have groundwater regulation, but that is a big lacuna that is not going to be so easy to resolve. Because right now groundwater is mostly in private hands, in the sense like we know our wells, our tube wells, many of them are owned privately. So how are you going to tell 23 million private owners of tube wells? You have to convince them that water is a common property resource. It is not yours to draw out and use and exploit as you wish, but it will have to come under some kind of commonly accepted laws. So this is going to be a huge challenge. If you had, I have a bore well in my house, and the BWSSB, which is the parastatal agency that supplies water to us in Bangalore, it doesn't supply water every day. Even to the area I live in is a fairly well-off area, and we do get water. It is a low-lying area. We are right in the Koramangala Valley, which has a reasonably good, flows of water. And even so, we don't get water. In the summer, we've been getting it once in 3 days. So naturally, sometimes, and certainly for the plants and stuff, I don't use BWSSB water, because that would not be right. That water travels 110 kilometers away and is pumped up at very high cost to me from the river Kaveri down there below. And